Can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire?
Okay, here we are. Aloha, dear friends. How are you all? Ça va?
Ça va.
All of you? Fantastic. All right. Well, we are still walking along with Dorothy Baker, and we will probably be with her next week too, and then that will be the end of our life together. So, as we continue with her own teaching and administering and eventually pioneering, and there are comments made by people that have known her, and it's interesting to in this book to read what they say about her, so you get a better glimpse of who she is. So a certain Ali Deal, or Deal, Diehl, Ali, she heard of Baha'u'llah in Lima, Ohio, that's where they live, in 1947. Remember, we are now in the 40s, and we're going to be entering the early 50s very soon. So she heard of Baha'u'llah in Lima in 1947. Her memory of Dorothy as a local community member, you know that, of course, we all know that she was involved in local affairs, but she was the chairman of the National Assembly. I mean, she was big time, but she still had contacts with her local community. Her memory of Dorothy as a local community member stemmed solely from the years when outside responsibilities were such that logically Dorothy couldn't have had much energy to devote to Lima. But for her, placing the most important over the very important does not necessarily mean grand scale teaching over small scale. So she would always come back and participate. So one night, what Ali described as a typical fall Tuesday, early November 1947, she met Dorothy. She said, "I did not really wish to go to the Baha'i meeting, but because we had exhausted all the possible excuses for not going, my husband and I bowed to the inevitable. Really, I did not want to go. I had heard that the speaker was a rather wealthy person, and I must admit that contact with other rich ladies had not been a pleasant experience. Frankly, I had a strong prejudice against most anyone rich. So it was a small fireside where all knew each other, except I did not know Mrs. Baker. Those present were Joe Stoll, Mildred Stoll, Lillian Wilson, Mrs. Baker, and myself. First impressions can be powerful, and I was struck with the thought of how this sincere, beautiful lady could possibly be associated with rich people. I'm hearing some noise there. I don't know where it's coming from. I'm hearing some noise. I have to just cut it. Do you guys hear the noise? I had to cut some noise. I muted somebody. I muted. I had to mute. So it was a small fireside. The economic barrier was dissolved instantly. The lesson too was powerful. After being introduced as a person who would tell about the Baha'i faith, Mrs. Baker said that she would try to tell the listeners about the Baha'i faith. The word try stays with me today because the illustration she gave was practical, meaningful. Gesturing with her fingers to form the shape of a small box. She developed the idea that if she had a gift to give, it might be in a box that big. She gestured. That box could be wrapped in beautiful paper with a beautiful bow. On the box could be a card of greeting, yet to have the gift within, a person would have to open the box himself. No one else could do this for the individual. Knowing the Baha'i faith is the same thing. A person cannot be given this wonderful gift of God without opening the box and taking the gift. That fireside was long ago, but the impression of the compelling personality has remained. I had experienced something that evening most people rarely have. I had met someone who could demonstrate her teachings through her own life. As a Baha'i teacher, Dorothy had no equal. She gave me an education that would shame many. Using the works of the Guardian, she would use the technique of analyzing the writings by looking at parts of speech. We studied pattern of Baha'i life by listing the verbs, then the nouns, the adjectives, and the adverbs. Once the words were pointed out, each would be counted and discussed. This has helped me to memorize many of the prayers and given me a skill that is invaluable. Deepening classes would be on time, scholarly, and well organized. Outlining was the method used and encouraged. She was well prepared and would readily show the references in the writings. Impromptu questions on a personal level were answered immediately, followed by a letter 2 or 3 days later, recapping her comments with a specific reference, usually from Abdu'l-Baha. The typewritten letter would sometimes run 2 pages. Dorothy always had time to see people who wanted special help with personal problems. A call ahead for an appointment would assure time in either the library or Pullman at the Elm Street Home Center. The interview was never rushed, and there was time to talk through the entire concern. The advice given was solid and wise. I remember the constant admonition to obey the administrative order, regardless of the demands placed upon the individual. That's the memory of this lady. Now, Artemus Lamb, another active Baha'i, remembers her this way. She says, I have never been very adept at describing people. And when it came to trying to describe Dorothy, I'm sure my own lack of capacity and experience prevented me from adequately perceiving many of her qualities. I do know that I and everyone I knew wanted to be with her at every possible moment to try to imbibe a little of her knowledge, inspiration, and love. At one of my first conventions in the USA, Dorothy was chairman of the convention. In her opening remarks, she stated that often it was thought that spirituality and efficiency did not go together, that it was either one or the other. However, she did not believe this was so, and she hoped this convention would be both spiritual and efficient. Now, as I write this, I realize that it was this balance in Dorothy that impressed me greatly. Then, again, we are going through some of the comments, some of the memories of people that knew her. A certain Hattie Chamberlain, who's a Baha'i in Massachusetts, she says she was, speaking of Dorothy, she was a dynamic and powerful teacher. I remember well at the convention in the temple at Wilmette, Illinois, when volunteers were asked to pioneer to Africa, Dorothy immediately went to one corner of the foundation hall and said, and I quote, "We'll begin right here and form the line." Now, from Edna True, I guess her mother was I don't know if it was, she was the hand of the cause.
Corin True.
Corinne True, right. She was the hand of the cause of God, Corinne True. And she was Corinne and Edna True served on the NSA and on the Continental Board of Counselors. So she said, my next association, she said, with Dorothy was on the NSA. I was elected in 1946. In the early days, my mother, Corinne True, was elected chairman of the Temple Unity Committee. Dorothy was the first and until now the only woman chairman of the NSA. Now, we all know that later on, Dorothy Nelson, the judge, was the chairman of the NSA of the US. But for many years, it was Dorothy Baker. Her sense of humor was simply superb. It trickled through everything she did. I don't care how serious, she always found room for a little laugh. So she took this in the same way. She said, oh, the man can't decide which one they want. You watch me, Eddie. It will be for 1 year. That's all it will be. It will be the last. She thought they would never be elected again as chairman. The men of the NSA used to tease her a little bit because she was rather extravagant sometimes in her vocabulary. We went over one day to an NSA meeting right from the convention where she had talked about Latin America. She had spoken of girdles of immorality around South America. She used this expression and they never let her forget it. And no one would laugh harder than she would at herself. It was wonderful to see. They just loved to tease her about the different expressions she would use. Now, let me just read an extract from Hand of the Cross Paul Haney when he was still, at the time, a member of the NSA. And he recorded this as a memory of Dorothy in 1976. I will just read part of it. She says, I served with Dorothy from 1946 to 1953 on the United States National Spiritual Assembly. She was a person of such great qualities and capacities that it's very difficult to characterize them. But certainly, she combined in a unique way the qualities of both an outstanding teacher and an outstanding administrator. And that is a combination that is not often found. She was indeed unique in that respect, and in both fields, she had the ability to bring out the best capacities that were latent within the people with whom she was associated in the faith. I recall that in the difficult and often slugging sessions of the National Assembly, she had the unique capacity and ability to raise our sights to a true concept of the real purpose of the work we're engaged in and what its ultimate objective should be. As a platform speaker on the faith, or indeed on any subject, she had no peer. Dorothy had an ability in an abundant measure to go across the footlights in a very wonderful way, which for the most part, only great actors and actresses possess. And she used it not to project her own personality, but to project the teachings. Whenever she spoke of the faith, what she said struck home to the hearts of the listeners. It was not just her eloquence, which enabled her to evoke such a response, but also her sincerity and her dedication to the faith and her deep knowledge of the teachings. All these things in combination produced an effect that people really marveled at and in some cases envied. Before I became a member of the NSA in Rizwan 1946, I had heard Dorothy speak and I knew that she was a great teacher of the faith, but I had no conception of the extent of her administrative capacity. I was soon to learn that. At the very first meeting, which the 4 new members attended, while the convention was still going on, the first order of business was the election of officers. To everyone's surprise and astonishment, Dorothy was elected chairman, the first and only woman who had ever been chairman of the NSA of the United States. During the convention that followed that year until she went to Latin America at the time of the convention in 1951, she served as the chairman of the annual convention and set a pattern of performance that I'm sure subsequent chairmen, including myself, have striven to emulate, but have never fully succeeded. I recall that during the first and second year of our service together on the NSA, she had written The Guardian asking for the bounty of pilgrimage. At that time, The Guardian replied that the trip to the Gulf countries in Europe would be more marvelous, meritorious. With characteristic obedience and happiness, because the guardian's wish was her command, she immediately arose and made the trip to Europe and all the Gulf countries in those critical early months of the second 7-year plan. One can imagine how much her visits must have meant in those difficult years to the pioneers who were struggling to establish the faith in those countries and to the few believers who had at that point accepted the faith. Louise Baker, her daughter, shared something. She says, the first time mother chaired the national convention, she found that she could not keep control of the consultation. It tended to become heated, get off the subject, and she couldn't remember the order in which people had raised their hands to speak. Finally, she called a 10-minute recess. Mother went immediately to the cornerstone, as she always did when she had a problem. She was very tense and nervous and prayed, "Oh God, I can't handle this. What can I do? I feel as though I were in the middle of a terrible vortex that drags me down." She forced herself to take a few deep breaths, relax, and clear her mind. Suddenly, she seemed to hear a voice saying, "In the middle of a vortex, there's absolute quiet." Immediately, she felt relaxed and confident. She went back to the foundation hall and proceeded to handle one of the stormiest conventions we have had over the years. Now and then, she would simply close her eyes when things threatened to get out of hand and stand quietly for a moment or two to regain the calm at the heart of the vortex. Now, so those are just few glimpses of her life in those years when she was a member of the NSC. In 1940, Louise Baker turned 18 and Bill 17. University or the family business were the obvious choices for Bill, but Louise wasn't so sure. Those were the daughters that she had with Frank, and the other two children were her stepchildren, were the children of her husband. So at the last time, she decided, her daughter, Louise, to forego her fall enrollment at Rollins College, majoring in history, and apply to Scudder Secretarial School in New York. Frank and Dorothy were more than a little surprised with her answer when they asked about the reason behind her change of plans. She said she had decided to move to South America, but thought she would need skill to support herself there. Louise had a good background in Spanish already, and she had decided to train as a bilingual secretary. Neither Frank nor Dorothy knew quite how to respond to this surge of independence from their daughter, who seemed suddenly transformed from a rambunctious teenager to a strong-willed young woman with her own ideas about how she wanted to live. The two of them talked it over. Frank was against an international move from the start, but Dorothy was more open. The Inter-American Committee was in need of pioneers in South America. She was delighted that her daughter might be able to go. Another single young woman might not be hardy enough, but Dorothy knew Louise and her strengths. If she had the will to go, Dorothy was in favor of letting her try. The next summer, with Louise home from secretarial school for vacation, Dorothy was doubly glad for her decision. She was doing a lot of writing, and her daughter's new typing skills were very useful. On January 1st, 1943, Louise was on her way to Bogota. At that time, South America was not really developed at all. I don't think there were even any NSAs in South America. So she went there in January 1st, 1943 to Bogota, Colombia. Reports to the Inter-American Committee and home to her parents were positive. Dorothy began making plans to visit the young Baha'i community. Dorothy herself decided to go to visit where Winnie Lou or Louise lived. She decided to learn Spanish first, and in her typical style, set up a class so that anyone else in Lima who wanted to learn could join her. Just remember that she managed to get almost all the Baha'is, over 30 Baha'is in that city, Lima, that was persecuted to become all pioneers. I mean, I don't know how she did that. That's something pretty unheard of. Hi, Susie. So, pardon? Frank bought some Spanish language records, and Dorothy managed to stay one lesson ahead of the class she taught, which was made up mostly of Baha'is. She planned to leave Lima in December for a 2-month teaching trip beginning in Bogota. On December 10th, Horace Hawley, the secretary of the NSA, sent her a cable from Wilmette. She said, "We all feel assured splendid results from your important undertaking. May your influence guide and inspire precious nucleus faith in Colombia." Upon her arrival at the Colonial Hotel in Miami, Florida, the last stop before her flight to South America, Dorothy received a cable that must have given her heart wings. "Fervent prayers accompany you, loving appreciation, Shoki Rabbani." Shoki Effendi, he just followed her all the time. Louise found that by the time Dorothy got to Bogota, she had a good base of Spanish to build on, but could not carry on even a simple conversation. She spoke naturally enough at many meetings, and I translated for her, she said. This method worked, but Dorothy was determined to put her limited Spanish to use. She told Louise which stories she wanted to use in her talks and asked Louise to tell them to her in the simplest Spanish, keeping the verbs in the present tense wherever possible. Louise told her the same story 5, maybe 6, or even 7 times, trying to use the same words to make the job of learning them easier. Louise carefully translated every sentence at the next public talk, but right in the middle, Dorothy launched into her Spanish story, the enthusiastic response of her listeners. After several weeks in Bogota, Dorothy and Louise traveled to Barranquilla, Colombia, especially to visit an early Colombian Baha'i, Señor Carlos Nieto. In a letter to the Inter-America Committee mailed just before leaving Colombia for Venezuela, Dorothy wrote, "Upon arrival in Bogota, 6 believers confirmed by Mr. Gerald Slater, the classes being conducted, one by Mr. Slater and one by Winifred Louise Baker, were courteously turned over to the visitor and open to guests. A class on the dispensation of Baha'u'llah was organized for believers and close students, and teas and conferences were arranged for others. You all doubtless know now the joyous news that 2 new believers who have enrolled, and the Guardian of the National Assembly approved an immediate election. I hope that the report has reached you safely. Several more are close." Now we're going to stick with her to South America because a lot of interesting things happened. 2 weeks in Colombia had improved Dorothy's Spanish to the extent that she arrived in Venezuela with a stock of Baha'i stories and enough vocabulary to locate and talk to the native contacts who had learned the faith from earlier teachers and pioneers. She recorded with enthusiasm what must have been difficult maneuvers on her first foreign teaching trip. That's her first trip outside of the US. She says, "The extreme cordiality of the people forbids the foreign feeling in Caracas. What a happy task it was to find one by one the friends of Gwen Schultes, a former pioneer, and remind them of the great cause which had been the object of her love and devotion while among them. They had not forgotten, and some of them were glad to come to the little meetings at the Gran Americana. Delightful contacts of Mr. and Mrs. Emmerich Sala were later added, and new friends found their way to the little gatherings. Through the courtesy of Senora Trina Kurlander, editor of the magazine Pro America and president of the National Club for the Union of American Women, a world of friendships opened up. The meetings grew to about 40 in attendance. At the close of a period of 5 weeks, 8 historic souls accepted the joy of responsibility of the world order under the Guardian. She always comes back when she says, doesn't say they became Baha'is, it says they accepted the joy of responsibility of the world order under the Guardian. And in addition, 1 youth and 1 adult who lacked permanent residency. Senora Corlander herself became one of the group that organized On that memorable night, all were present when Dr. David Escalante was elected the first secretary, and all assisted in laying the first plans for feast and regular classes. So, the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and South America received numerous visits from Dorothy over the next few years. So obviously we're not going to go through all those years. Viva Lismore, born in Swedish parents, moved to Cuba with her husband in 1936, unaware of the existence of the Baha'i faith. She wrote that a friend, Josephine Kruka, phoned me up and invited me to attend a lecture by Rosemary Sala, but at the time I could not gather up sufficient energy to attend anything, as my family and myself were in deep sorrow over the passing of our eldest son, Hugo, killed in action on June 6, 1944. However, I invited Miss Kruka and Rosemary Sala, as well as Jean Silver, for tea. They stayed for several hours, but never mentioned the word Baha'i. I remember Rosemary told me that they had a highly spiritual nature. They invited me to come and hear another traveling teacher, Dorothy Baker, speak. I felt I could not refuse. When I arrived at the large hall where she gave her talk, the two resident pioneers were at the door welcoming the guests. They asked me to join the group sitting on the platform, but I preferred to sit with the audience. I felt rather upset by the fact that the translator was not conveying into Spanish what Dorothy Baker was saying in English. I sat there listening to Dorothy Baker speak, a trim figure on the platform, wearing a small hat, and quite suddenly I saw a halo of light around her head. I asked my neighbor whether she could see it, and she replied, no. Again, I asked her if she could see this halo of light around the speaker's head, which was gradually becoming brighter. Her negative answer surprised me. At this moment, Dorothy Baker said, anyone who wishes to hear more about Baha'u'llah can come to the Baha'i Center for the next 10 days, where I shall be seeing the friends mornings and evenings. I had never heard the word Baha'u'llah before, and it went straight to my heart and has never left since. From then on, my life changed entirely. I felt that I had embarked on a journey without a compass, but I felt confident that the journey would be guided, protected, and illuminated. Now, this story of the halo freaks you out. I don't know. In 1945, Dorothy Baker was in Mexico on a delicate mission for the National Special Assembly. Her goal was to disentangle the nascent Baha'i community from the grip of a spiritualist who tried to control the Friends. On the way there, Dorothy shared the train compartment with Gail Wilson. Amelia Collins accompanied them to the station in Chicago. Gail wrote what happened. While at the depot waiting for the train in which Dorothy and I had reserved a compartment, we sat at a small round table with metal legs in a restaurant at the station where we had coffee and talked. I basked in the light of their presence and inspiring a conversation which resolved principally around the guidelines given by the Guardian to consolidate and expand the work of the faith in Latin America. The love for the Guardian and the desire to follow his guidance was supermost in our hearts. The departure of our train was announced. Dear Millie, as we lovingly called her, recited by heart with profound feeling and sincerity the tablet of Visitation by Abdu'l-Baha. The spirit of it accompanied us on our journey. When Dorothy and I were settled in our compartment, one of the first things she talked about was the magnificent and thrilling new book of The Guardian, God Passes By, a classic which recently had been published. As yet, I had not read it. She conveyed that it was gem-like, ingenious presentation of a summary of the first eventful 100 years of the Baha'i faith, 1844-1944. Dorothy carried a copy of the book with her. How profoundly she treasured it. Among the things that Dorothy related to me in the course of our journey was an episode in God Passes By about the critical period at the time of the early Babis. Baha'u'llah told them in part to recite the prayer of the Bab, which we call the removal of difficulties, 500 times. She then said, let us say that prayer 500 times for special assistance with the work of Mexico, in Mexico. I was delighted, settled for prayer in our compartment. She tore up some paper into small pieces with which to keep count. We took turns saying the prayer a number of times, each 10 or 20. When we finished, it felt as though we were endowed with renewed vitality and fortified with a new spirit, inner peace, and feeling of assurance that success would be obtained. Now, you're never going to hear of a Baha'i that prayed as much as Dorothy Baker. I mean, you may, I don't know. I think it's very, very rare. The train stopped in San Antonio, Texas, for a considerable length of time, perhaps an hour or so. The passengers were able to leave the train. Dorothy and I went out, and for exercise, we walked up and down a stretch of the tracks on the wood planks between the rails and top. She always had something interesting and instructive to say. One continually learned from her. Mexico City was reached about September 21st, 1945. Dorothy and I settled in a moderately priced hotel. Our room had a small parlor where friends could be received. Identifying the man who exerted such power over the Baha'i community was simple enough, but removing his negative influence was another story. Dorothy first held a special meeting at which she explained to the Baha'i the need to keep the faith in its pure form rather than introduce a lot of unrelated practices and beliefs. To the man who was using his psychic practices to influence and gain control over the new Baha'is, Dorothy spoke with great strength. At one point, Rosemary Sala, who with her husband, Emerick, pioneered for 14 years in South Africa, then in Mexico, accompanied Dorothy to call upon the individual. Rosemary was repulsed by the man's countenance. Looking into his eyes, she saw a dark, treacherous abyss and felt the presence of personified evil. Shocked and repelled, Rosemary asked Dorothy, "How can you be near him?" "Well," she said, "he is a human soul, and going through his own tragedy, we must either let him cut himself away or receive him and change him." After meeting with him, Dorothy settled on a method of offering the Baha'is an alternative to his totally dominant influence. Rosemary Sala remembered the story. She said, "We sat in the park in the middle of the Avenida de la Reforma, and she said to the long healing prayer, which Marcia Gale had just translated, and we repeated it together. In the evening, when we saw Dorothy, she said that she had had this inspiration. She was going to hunt for a new center. She would tell the Baha'is about the new center and would invite all of them to come. Those who came to the new center would be considered the members of the new community of Baha'is in Mexico City, and this was the way she healed the situation without causing any disunity or any disagreements or any discussion between the believers, which was perfect. They made their own choice freely. No enmity was caused. This was a wonderful example of her wisdom and gentleness." In fact, Gail Wilson recalled that at the community gathering, a Baha'i lady offered her home at the new meeting place. It was large and modern and served the community well. The leader of the spiritualism group and his family dropped out of the faith, and an election was held to fill the vacancies on the local spiritual assembly. With the strain and tension gone from the community, inactive Baha'is even began to reappear. Mexico City strengthened. Dorothy felt able to spend the last part of her trip teaching in Puebla and Veracruz. In April 1945, Luis Baker had arrived in Caracas, Venezuela, to help form the first local spiritual assembly in Venezuela. There she found Yolanda Stronach, one of the women whom Dorothy had taught more than a year earlier during her first South American visit. With her one pamphlet and Spanish prayer book, Yolanda had held together and strengthened the first few Baha'is of Venezuela, almost all of them women. In February 1946, again, we're skipping a year almost, Dorothy and Frank left Lima to visit Louise and travel through Jamaica and Cuba. On their return, arriving in Caracas, they found a small, thriving Baha'i community. Dorothy gave numerous classes there. One evening, Dorothy, Louise, and several of the Venezuelan friends were at a meeting in Yolanda's home. The class, like others she gave, had been advertised in the newspapers. Late into the evening, there was a knock at the door. Yolanda opened it and found two men standing outside. Is a Mrs. Baker in this house? Their presence didn't seem inspired by any spiritual quest. They were direct enough, but somehow suspect. In an effort to be courteous yet cautious, Yolanda said, did you read about Mrs. Baker's visit in the paper, or are you friends of some of the Baha'is? Neither. Is she here? Hearing this exchange from the couch where she sat, Dorothy went to the door. I am Mrs. Baker. Do you wish to see me? Yes, we have a message. They came into the small parlor, their eyes on Dorothy, not even glancing at the rest of the people in the room. The tallest one stood quietly, but before Yolanda could even close the door or ask them to sit down, the other one began to speak. A man came to us with a message for Mrs. Baker. Again, Dorothy said, I am Mrs. Baker. The two men looked at one another, presumably for a signal that each believed this was the woman they had come to find. Their expressions didn't change, but some sign must have passed between them because after a long pause, the shorter man spoke again. In our practice, we receive messages. This one is for you. A man in robes, dark hair, dark beard, wishes us to extend his greetings to Mrs. Baker. Dear Mrs. Baker, greetings from the Bab. The room remained quite still. Those who weren't sure they had heard correctly didn't even whisper their questions. Dorothy, who had been staring dispassionately into the speaker's face, then at the tall man's unmoving feature, asked, how did you receive the message? Excuse me. I have to have somebody in. Sorry, I'm just welcoming Alex. Sorry. How did you receive the message? He came to us in our practice and told us where to find you. What is your practice? We are spiritualists. We meet to receive word from other worlds. Would you like to know more about the man who spoke with you about the Bab? The Bab asked us to do his bidding, and we have nothing else is necessary. They turned and let themselves out, leaving Dorothy looking after them, and the rest of the room looking to Dorothy. So, very fascinating. On that same visit to Caracas, a native Baha'i woman came to Dorothy's hotel after attending several of her classes and asked to speak in private. Dorothy's Spanish was still limited, but Louise was there and able to translate. The three of them were outside into the garden and sat in a sunny corner, hidden from the lobby of the hotel by a semicircle of shrubs and trees. As soon as they were seated, the Venezuelan woman began to cry. Through her tears came disconnected pleas for help and the jumbled narrative of her problems. Louise, of course, you know Louise is the daughter, right? Louise struggled to understand, translating into English whatever short phrases she could glean from the woman's desperate staccato that melted at times into mourning sobs. The problems seemed hopelessly severe, but the details were unintelligible. I don't know what to do, Moz. She's so upset. I can't understand what she's saying. In surprise, Dorothy turned to her daughter and said, why, sweetie, it's perfectly clear. You go along while she and I talk. Horrified by what seemed to be the huge dimensions of the woman's problems and amazed that her mother could understand the garbled, almost senseless explanation, Louise left them to themselves. 2 hours later, they came in front of the garden. The native woman, looking refreshed and calm, with fond tenderness, they kissed each other goodbye on both cheeks, and the woman left. Louise Baker had her own problems to contend with, as Dorothy wrote in 1945. She says, Winnie Lou is sick dangerously low blood count, possible parasites, wants to stay but has to give up her job. Pray for her when we can, dearest. She feels failure in Caracas, but I think it is her health and being just too tired and busy. There is a little heartbreak in her letter. Someone has said that pioneering is ecstasy and tears, but I think it is true. Every country has its ransom. Maybe her health is just that. The mother of Ashraf said, "Go thou straight on, my son." Baha'i News in May 1946 reported Mr. and Mrs. Frank Baker have recently returned home after visiting assemblies in Caracas, Venezuela, Kingston, Jamaica, and Havana, Cuba. Luis Baker is remaining in Caracas until after the election. Shortly after Dorothy's return from South America, having sent reports on Rizwan elections, the State of Inter-America Committee goals and questions, she received correspondence from Shoki Effendi that included the following postscript in his own hand. Dear and valued co-worker, I'm truly grateful to you for your magnificent services rendered in such an exemplary spirit over so wide a field, despite so many obstacles and with such a distinction. Persevere in your high endeavors and remember always that the beloved is well pleased with the standard of your work and that my loving and continued prayers will continue to be offered on your behalf at the holy shrines. Your true and grateful brother Shoki. 4.5 months later, Ruhiya Khanum, on behalf of Shoki Effendi, wrote to Dorothy. He will pray for all those you mentioned in your letters, but particularly for your dear daughter Louise, who seems to be following most rapidly and closely in her devoted mother's footsteps. In the same letter, the Guardian wrote, Dear and valued co-worker, the expansion of your activities as a result of the inauguration of the new plan will enable you to display to a still greater extent the magnificent qualities that have distinguished in recent years your unique services to the faith of Baha'u'llah. I am proud of and feel deeply grateful for these services. Persevere in your glorious and historic tasks and rest assured that I will continue to pray for you from the depths of my heart. Your true and grateful brother Shoki. In the spring of 1946, just after Dorothy's teaching trip to South America, the needs of the continent fresh in her heart and mind, Ed and Muriel Miesler visited the Bakers to talk about regional teaching committee work. Ed's first wife, Emma, had died in 1939. Ed and Elma had dreamed of pioneering when the children were grown. Now Elma was gone. Ed still thought of pioneering, but there was a new family situation and the children, Margot and Bob, were teenagers now and still at school. Muriel was a fairly new Baha'i, having declared her belief about the time she and Ed married. Life was full enough of change and new responsibilities. The moment had never seemed quite right to add starting over in a new country. Sitting together as the comfortable breeze of cool Ohio afternoon blew through the living room, surrounded by the familiar, easy spirit of the house where both her guests had learned about the Baha'i faith, Dorothy said to Ed and Muriel, now, just what is it that is keeping you from going pioneering? We need pioneers in Latin America. The reasons seemed too numerous to even begin to explain, but the only one that came to mind was that the children were in school. Later, after more than 30 years at their post in Brazil, Ed still recalled how simply Dorothy put the problem into perspective. Since Bob will be graduating from high school and going to college, Margot has only one more year of high school. She can be our daughter during that year. Why don't you say the tablet of Ahmad every day for 19 days, then come back and let's talk it over. Long before the 19 days passed, the Mieslers were back offering to go anywhere they were needed in South America. In September, Dorothy said goodbye to Ed and Muriel, two more of what she called the people of destiny pioneers. She wrote to them, she said, goodbye, darlings of Baha'u'llah, and anchors away, vayan con Dios, may the angels attend you. Take along this bit of dust from the inner shrine of shrines. Baha'u'llah himself calls it potent, and our guardian calls it potent. And this, dear Muriel, is a quotation to which you will turn in time of need facing the blessed spot, and you will know that the holy Nawab is actually gifted to assist you when assemblies, committees, yes, and the dearest of friends are powerless to help you. Never be afraid. We have human hearts that become deeply troubled. Did not the heart of our adored master cry out many times, but not with fear? And she quotes, "He who does not love God fears all things, but he who loves God, all things fear him." You're like the pearl in which the master likened dear May Maxwell when he said, "One pearl is better than 1,000 wilderness of sand." When that pearl associates with and becomes the intimate of the pebbles, they also change into pearls. Eternal love, Dorothy. So, so Dorothy, she, anyways, back and forth travel. I mean, it's just a long story. Anyway, she went back to Mexico a bit later. In Mexico, the trip turned from a vacation to teaching. Luis was living in Veracruz, but traveled by bus every week to Coatepec, outside of Jalapa, where she gave an English class for contacts one night, went teaching the next day, and then on the second night gave a fireside deepening. The following morning, she would leave Coatepec for Puebla, where she had a similar schedule, and then take the bus to Mexico City for another 2 days, one night at the deepening, the next assisting the local assembly. On the seventh day, she would travel back to Veracruz to try to activate the small Baha'i group there. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's okay. Yes. Somebody's asking a question about the pearls. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I think that the letter about this, the famous pearls, was written to these pioneers that went to South America, the Mislers, Ed and Muriel Misler. Misler is spelled how? Misler is spelled Missler. That's the one about the pearls that, the story of the pearls that, remember the story. That I just read about, she says that you're like the pearl to which the master likened dear May Maxwell when he said, "One pearl is better than 1,000 wilderness of sand." When that pearl associates with and becomes the intimate of the pebbles, they also change into pearls. That was the story. I may have read it a bit too fast. So you see the gruesome week of activity of Louise, almost every night in a different place. On her first day in Veracruz, Dorothy told Louise that the schedule was too much for anyone and suggested dropping that city. Exhausted from constant bone-shaking bus rides, sleeping 2 nights a week on a plank bed with only a cotton blanket for a mattress and 2 other nights in a single bed shared with one of the native Baha'i women, Louise took her mother's advice. Frank and Dorothy helped her move to a comfortable room in Puebla. So in Coatepec, after Dorothy gave a talk, Louise took her parents to a hotel in nearby Jalapa rather than to the small family home where she usually stayed. High above sea level, cloudy, cold, and wet, Jalapa had a gruesome effect on Dorothy. She had often suffered from asthma and, in certain climates, but Louise, who wrote her account of that night, had never witnessed it before. That night in Jalapa, she couldn't lie down. She couldn't even relax in an armchair. Her breathing was painfully raucous. She spent the entire night sitting totally erect in a straight chair, not even able to lean back. That way she could breathe, although her breath rasped every inhalation. I wanted to go on up to Puebla, where the air was drier, but she wouldn't hear of it. I'll be just fine, she told me. You go to sleep and don't worry about me. I've had this often enough before and know what to do. I'll just say a few prayers. When I told her I'd stay up and keep her company, she sent me off to bed. It was abundantly clear that, close as we were, this was the time she needed to be alone. I woke up several times during the night to see her still sitting in her chair, the personification of Victorian good posture, her breath rattling into her lungs. I spoke to her the first time or two, but not after that, because she seemed to have retreated so far into herself and looked so utterly peaceful in spite of the noisy breathing and the rigid posture that she had difficulty in coming to the surface to answer me. While the Bakers helped their daughter move and visited some of the small towns where Louise had been teaching, the Bernsteins, who had traveled with Frank and Dorothy from the US, flew to Mexico City to wait for their friends. The four of them had planned a side trip to Cuernavaca, Taxco, and Acapulco, but when the Bakers returned to Mexico City, Dorothy asked if the others would mind going on without her so she could stay and help the Baha'is there and in Louise's gold town. The little group left and Dorothy carried on with the work she wanted to do. From Puebla, she wrote to The Guardian about plans and goals in Mexico and South America, among them the goal of forming one new local special assembly. To her delight, that Rizvan, what she called Louise's two new assemblies, Puebla and Coatepec, both formed. Dorothy's plans for the following winter included a teaching trip to Europe. The second 7-year plan had begun in 1946, the second collective enterprise undertaken by in American Baha'i history. It became known as the European Campaign, as Europe was the preeminent goal. Louise was not sure where she should serve. On June 21, 1947, Abdu'l-Bahá wrote to Dorothy on behalf of The Guardian. The work your dear daughter is doing is very much appreciated. In regard to her future plans, he feels that although she can render valuable service in Latin America, the work in Europe at present is more urgent, particularly in Spain. He therefore urges you to, by all means, take her to Europe with you and try to arrange for her to remain in Spain, or if that is not possible, in Portugal. Please give his loving greetings to Mr. Baker and assure him of how greatly he admires the spirit of sacrifice he shows in enabling you to serve so constantly. Then Shawki Effendi wrote, Dear and prized co-worker, I deeply regret the delay in acknowledging the receipt of your letters and reports, which I have read with interest, gratitude, and admiration. You are truly rendering in both the teaching and administrative field services which posterity will gratefully remember and extol. The friends praise and admire the spirit you manifest, the ability and devotion and zeal with which you promote the manifold interest of the faith, should feel happy, grateful, and confident. The work in Europe stands in great need of workers such as you, and I pray that you and your dear daughter may be guided and richly blessed in this new and highly meritorious activity in the European field. Persevere in your noble task and rest assured that the Beloved is watching over you and is well pleased with the standard of your achievements. Your true and grateful brother, Shawki. Louise decided this might be the perfect time for her mother to receive permission to go on pilgrimage, since she would be traveling to Europe as well. Shawki Effendi might allow them both to go. Together they wrote to The Guardian, and on January 1948, we received the following reply. Now, he wrote them back and all that and said, you can't come now. This is like the third or fourth time when she's trying to go to the Holy Land. It just doesn't work because now the situation, she said, dangerous condition in the country. So This will have to be postponed. Anyway. So, she left and she went pioneering to Portugal. Now, while Louise began to settle in as a pioneer in Portugal, Dorothy visited all the European Gulf countries of the second 7-year plan, as well as others like Ireland, England, France, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. So you just can imagine what this woman has done. Everywhere she held press conferences, spoke to small and large groups, and met with pioneers and native Baha'is to encourage and inspire them. Now, in early March, Dorothy arrived in Portugal to meet Louise with a letter from Ruhiya Khanum in hand. The letter asked that they call on a certain friend of Ruhiya Khanum and of her mother, May Maxwell. The gentleman, Hubert Matthias, lived in Lisbon, but had befriended the Maxwells in Germany some 14 years before. Greatly impressed with the older and younger Canadian ladies, with their spirit and their personalities, he began to study the faith and eventually accepted it, writing directly to Haifa. So Louise was aware that Ruhiya Khanum hoped he would contact her German friend, but in an unusual spurt of shyness, had resisted the impulse, waiting for the support of her mother's presence. Instead, Louise visited with Virginia Orbison. Virginia was later named the Knight of Baha'u'llah as the first pioneer to the Balearic Islands, east of Spain. I vaguely remember being her presence in Madrid when we were pioneering from Egypt to Morocco. We stopped in Spain, and I think the name Virginia Orbison, as well as Elsia Austin, all were people that were very around us, you know. We were kids at the time, of course, so didn't get to talk to them at all. So she was named Knight of Baha'u'llah as the first pioneer of the Balearic Islands, east of Spain. Louise also made another friend, Valeria Nichols, who was then pioneering in Portugal. So now here is the story of Hubert Matthias, this guy that was recommended by Ruhiya Khanum, and that had been introduced to the faith by the Maxwells. He said, in Lisbon, Portugal, in early 1948, I lived in a room with a balcony and I rented from a German woman with 2 kids. I think it was on a Friday in March that I received a phone call from an American woman, Valeria Nichols, on behalf of Mrs. Dorothy Baker, to please come for dinner at the American Club the following Sunday. As always, on weekends, I drove out to my very primitive country place, but returned early on Sunday afternoon to Lisbon to appear in the American Club betimes. When I entered the club on the 4th floor of an apartment building, the manager took me to the table in the right corner where 3 ladies were sat, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Nichols, and Louise Baker. The reception was very cordial, as they were Baha'is and I had joined the faith in a letter to Haifa several weeks earlier. I don't think they knew that, and of course, were very happy when I told them so. My mood was a strange one because before leaving my quarters, I had strange premonitions, and some inner voice had repeatedly told me, tonight, you're going to meet your wife. Tonight, you're going to meet your wife. I told myself, calming my trembling hands, not to be hysterical and to calm down. When I entered, I first saw the 3 ladies and noticed Miss Baker's tiny little hat with short little black feather-like bunches of thick hair sticking out on 2 sides. I decided that of this hat, I would make a shaving brush. There was, for me, no doubt that the young woman would be my wife. And of course, her mother, Mrs. Baker, my mother-in-law. Dorothy put me at ease with her graciousness, and I felt at home with them, just as I had with the Maxwells years ago when I met Mrs. Maxwell and her daughter in Munich, Germany. They had brought me to Canada and the States in 1938, my first visit to America. Mary Rohia had given Miss Baker my address as she was going to Portugal, encouraging her to look me up. This had led to the invitation for dinner, which we were now about to eat. I guess we talked about the Maxwells, about Portugal, and about the Baha'i faith, and afterwards they asked me to come to the apartment where there would be a meeting. The 4 or 5 people that came were Portuguese, and I was asked to translate Mrs. Baker's talk to them. I had lived in Portugal for about 5 years already, so my Portuguese was good enough. I remember hesitating when Dorothy said something that I considered to be somewhat unwise to be said more or less publicly in a police state, as Portugal was at the time. But she nodded forcefully to make me translate exactly what she had said. The next day in the morning, we all went to see the Moorish castle on top of a hill on the east side of downtown Lisbon. And for the next days, we drove to Sintra and other places of note. Mrs. Baker struck me as a very exceptional woman of high intelligence and great empathy. Her gray eyes were extremely expressive, and the pronounced jaw in her beautiful face indicated a strong will and strong convictions. On the way down from Sintra Castle, the elder ladies had gone ahead and given Louise and me a chance to talk with each other. And it was then probably that we realized that our premonitions of meeting each other had been sound and realistic. I remember stating to myself that the way Louise treated me, I wanted to be treated for the rest of my life. In the evening, Dorothy took me aside where we were alone, kissed me on both cheeks, and said, "Hubert, I'm all for it." As a result of May Maxwell's and Abdu'l-Baha Khanum's friendship with Hubert, years before in Germany, this young man, his family torn apart by war, his body scarred, and one arm temporarily paralyzed by the effects of Russian bullets, had decided alone in Portugal to become a Baha'i. Through obedience to Shoti Effendi's instructions, Louise Baker had moved to the Iberian Peninsula, her first post outside of Latin America, where she had spent some very lonely, difficult years. Following both the instructions of Shoti Effendi to teach in Europe and the request of Reha Khanum to look up the young German in Portugal, Dorothy brought the situation to its culmination. When news reached Rohia Khanum that Louise and Hubert were married, she wrote to Hubert, June 20th, 1948, from Haifa, "And will you believe me if I confess that my secret and ardent hope, the guardian is my witness, was that by just a miracle, this very thing would happen to you and Winfried Louise would fall in love and marry? In the beginning, this end may have been out of sight for all involved, or perhaps the sequence of events was forecast in one mind or another. At least Dorothy, Louise, and Hubert had premonitions. But whatever the combination of original intentions, the result were satisfactory. On October 20, 1948, Rohia Khanum wrote, "Dearest Dorothy, I enjoy your letters so much that it was so sweet of you to give me a glimpse of the Portuguese romance. I was so happy about that marriage, and to know Hubert has come to rest in the Baha'i harbor. He's a fine soul and has much needed qualities in the cause." In other countries, Dorothy visited. The spirit of the assemblies and individuals was recharged with hope and enthusiasm. Isabel Sabri later served as member of the Continental Board of Counselors in Africa and at the International Teaching Center in Haifa. She pioneered in Africa for more than 30 years. She was married to Hassan Sabri. And Hassan Sabri was very close to my father. And when I was at school at Stanford, I was about to get my degree, they came to me to visit me. I was a resident fellow at the French house I was running. I was a resident fellow. They came and they told me, get your PhD, get your citizenship, and go to Africa. That's all they told me. And a year later, I came back to Central Africa. That's because of both the visit of Isabel Sabri and Hassan Sabri. So when Isabel met Dorothy Baker in Scotland, she was still a fairly new Baha'i. She said, the second time I met Dorothy Baker was in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the winter of 1948. I had become a believer 2 months after meeting her in California, and in 1946, went as a pioneer to the British Isles during the 6-year plan there. My parents were British, so I had dual nationality and was able to live and work in Britain, no difficulty. Dorothy had written to the Guardian asking permission to visit the Holy Land of Pilgrimage. It replied that it would be more meritorious to visit the pioneers and young communities in the countries of Europe. Scotland was one of her first stops. After a series of meetings in Edinburgh, which resulted a few days later in the declaration of the first Scottish believers there, a Mr. and Mrs. Wood, who had been greatly impressed by Dorothy's spirituality, the two of us traveled together by train from Edinburgh to Glasgow, where she was to catch her plane. During the journey, Dorothy recited prayer after prayer by memory. It was remarkable to me how many prayers she knew by heart. Dorothy always gave considerable thought and attention to her appearance. She spoke to me of the fact that even one's manner of dress would attract the listeners to the faith. She explained that she had chosen a different color and outfit for each country was to visit, according to the nature of the people of the country as she perceived them to be. For Scotland and England, she had chosen a lovely soft gray ensemble, and for Spain, red. Certainly, Dorothy made the most of her natural charm. There was a quality of impeccability about her. She also paid attention to the details of her manner and words. One sensed that she had really studied how to express herself, how to teach the faith effectively. She didn't leave things to chance. She prepared herself meticulously for her teaching trips and her lectures. She carried in her suitcase considerable quantities of special mimeograph materials, answers to questions which she had prepared, ready to give to those who showed interest. She once said to me, "What is the use of God sending a soul into your life to teach if you're not ready and prepared to help him?" In speaking at gatherings of the Baha'is only, Dorothy always took pains to have small vignettes or bits of information about the faith to tell them, which they would probably not have heard before. This made her a particularly appealing speaker to believers. All right. I think this is probably a good place to stop. Do you think? Can go further, but I don't know. There's good things ahead. I don't want to tire you too much. Mm, yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're going to be still in England next time because we are not done yet. This is 1948. We're getting close to 1950, and so there's a lot of few more surprises ahead of us.